Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's enjoying our conference, and thanks for joining us for the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager. My name is Rafa Maya. I'm a first-year MBA student here, and as a former college basketball player, I'm super excited to present our next presentation, the Biomechanics of Buckets, the next revolution in basketball analytics. And please help me welcome Kurt Goldsberry, our next speaker, NBA analyst for ESPN.
All right. Thank you, my dude. Hey, everybody. Before I begin my remarks, I want to just take a minute to remind you all, student-run conference. Students like Rafa from MIT put on this amazing conference. It's so great to be back here in person, but it is a very impressive student-run event. So thank you to you and your peers, Rafa. I want to take a few minutes of your time today to talk about a vision I have in a collaboration I'm a part of, and that's something I'll emphasize multiple times today, about where I see one part of basketball analytics going in the next 10 years. For those of you who don't know me, I currently work at ESPN, and I teach sports analytics at the University of Texas. I wrote a book called Sprawl Ball. Most people know me because I put charts up on the internet, and that's fine. But I used to run the analytics group in the San Antonio Spurs organization and worked for Team USA basketball. Shout out Coach K, who's having a big weekend too. Again, when people think about my work, they think about graphics like this. I try to bring spatial and visual reasoning to sports analytics. That's sort of my way into the business. People have seen my maps. But guys, really what I want to emphasize with my work, and it's going to extend into this current project, is I've been sort of clamoring for more spatial and more visual treatments within our field of sports analytics. That's why I'm here today. And that's going to continue as we go into the human body, which you'll see. I'd be remiss if I didn't sort of mention 10 years ago, I made my debut on this stage talking about shot charts and the science of wear and bringing the science of wear to basketball. That conference changed my life. I started doing media shortly after the finals preview in New York Times, really the first thing I ever wrote about basketball. So again, applaud the Sloan Conference. Thanks for all that's given to me. It's an incredible opportunity and event. There are three shifts I really want to contextualize what I'm going to talk about today in these three shifts in sports analytics. Number one, we're going from outcomes to processes. Baseball, you're ahead of us as usual, but we're measuring less and less about the outcomes like RBIs and doubles and more about the processes. How hard a player can swing a baseball bat or throw a baseball, looking at angular velocities of joints that help explain velocity in baseball. That's been a breakthrough. Another big shift is we are, across sports, going from an environment where we just looked largely at game data to an environment where we're looking a lot at game data plus practice data and plus these lab data sets. My good friend Kyle Bodie runs Driveline Baseball in Seattle, and they've really led this charge. And I think that's a perfect example of how we're collecting data about athletes, not in competitive environments, but in lab settings or practice environments. Understanding these data is a huge new challenge for this group in front of me today. And part of that, I think, when you look at sports analytics at its worst, it's kind of like employee surveillance, and we have been separated from athletes, monitoring them, surveilling them, judging their value. And one of the things I'm excited about with this project is bringing the kind of analytical reasoning into the player development realm, bringing it down to the playing surface for the athletes to actually get better. So I think those are three big shifts that contextualize why I think what I'm about to talk about is going to dominate basketball analytics. If there was a first law of sports analytics, which I don't think there is, it might be this. What gets measured gets managed, and what doesn't, doesn't. One of the things that's happening undeniably in our field right now is we're measuring more and more and more and more, and that's opportunities to manage and understand and to learn. And I think that's a big part of where we are in 2022. In terms of the sport I love the most, again, we're measuring stuff in practice now. We're measuring stuff with sleep and nutrition. We're measuring and measuring all these different things. You have to form that into your analytical framework at an organization. And fortunately for us, we continue to steal from other sports. Golf and baseball, I have to acknowledge, as ahead of us in this domain I'm going to talk to you guys about today. As it relates to hoops, shooting is the most important skill in the sport right now at every level of play. So just like biomechanics and 3D motion capture have revolutionized our approach to pitching in baseball, I anticipate a similar thing happening to shooting in basketball over the next 10 years. The first word on this top bullet is really the biggest question of the 2020s in sports analytics, in my opinion. I used to think about where a lot, but where we're going now is more of a why. Why is Russell Westbrook struggling to make jump shots? Why is Stephen Curry so good at that? The answers to those questions are different than we had generally been looking at in sports analytics for the last 10 years, at least in basketball. So why are some shooters better than others? That's one of the research questions for this project. How can we measure the underlying causes of these differences? And the goal for this project, which we're just starting and scratching the surface of now in Austin, is what I like to say with my team is to build the shot chart for the human body. So a few years ago at this conference, Rachel Marty from NOAA had one of the best Sloan talks I've ever seen. And she said, you know, from shot charts, now we can map the trajectory of the basketball, looking at the in-ring data. And she did a marvelous job of helping us understand how the flight of the basketball and in-ring data can help inform shooting evaluations. One of the best papers and talks we've seen here at Sloan. And I challenged myself then. I was like, well, okay, why is the arc of the ball different for some shooters than others? Why are some shooters more consistent with the arc or their in-ring data than others? And that's really the inspiration for this project, going into the human body, which means we have to read books and articles. So putting my nose back into the books, I had to read a lot about motor control research. And one thing that baseball has going for it is that it's a lot of discrete acts. There's not a lot of interaction. And in motor control research, this is often called a closed task. And in essence, you're doing the same thing over and over again with repeatability. There's no closeout defender rushing at you when you're shooting a free throw. And so your analytical framework has to account for the differences between how you're approaching these tasks. So free throws, guys, I think are the lowest hanging fruit here. Because in theory, a player should be trying to do the same thing each and every time. In theory, the goal is clear, and there's not a lot of openness to that task. There's not defenders. In theory, you should be doing that. Now, as soon as we talk about step-back jumpers or three-point shooting, that changes, because now it's contextual. One of the things that makes Stephen so great at shooting three-point shots is he can get into a shot 1,000 different ways. And that's a very different thing. When Stephen shoots a free throw, he's doing the same thing. You need to inform your research project with that in mind. And so motor control research has been very helpful. Right now, the system we're using to evaluate shooters is three-dimensional motion capture. We have an array of 40 cameras, and unfortunately, the only way to get accurate biomechanical data right now is to use the compression suit and markers. The NBA 2K suit is what a lot of people think of it as. That won't be the case if we're here in 5 years talking about biomechanics, but that is the case now. There's some really impressive work in computer vision happening. There's an arms race happening. But ultimately, our ability to get accurate joint centers right now is pretty limited, and the techniques to get them are pretty intrusive. It's not fun. It's not fun to set up, and it's not fun to perform in. That said, I think we've done a good job getting these data sets, and we look forward to a time, as my biomechanist partner says, where we can burn these markers and light them on fire and move on with our lives. But for now, this is the necessary evil, the inconvenient evil in our lives. I need to emphasize here today that I'm not a biomechanist myself. I'm a geography guy who's pretty good at making maps and graphics, so I'm the visualization person in this project. My business partner is a woman named Kate Jackson, who's a biomechanist who's worked with elite athletes for a long time in this space. Speaking of that NOAA data, one of the graphics I made a while back was just looking at in-ring data from the second spectrum system and looking at where missed threes in the NBA land. This is like 800,000 missed threes or something since 2013. And one thing you learn when you plot that is that a vast majority of missed threes in the NBA are short or long. They are depth errors in the ring. They are not left or right. And some of the research, there's not a lot of research on shooting, but the word velocity, which is very important in something like golf or baseball, we don't talk about velocity. But one of my favorite papers I read on free throw shooting mentioned that really great free throw shooters are able to control the velocity of the basketball. And it's not baseball where we're trying to max out the radar gun. We're trying to be very consistent in this task and executing the exact same velocity out of the hand. So some of our early work was mapping, what are the tolerances for velocity errors and how do they manifest in the ring? And really you got maybe a 0.4 of a mile per hour or half a mile per hour tolerance, depending on what kind of shot you're looking at for that. And a player like Giannis Antetokounmpo, who we know misses a vast majority of his free throws short, we can start to think about that as the arc is consistent. We know that. He's not getting enough velocity on those free throws. His stereotypical missed free throw, he's even made some air balls that we can all remember in the Toronto series and other moments, but he doesn't put the right velocity on the basketball. That's his quintessential mistype. The question then becomes, well, where in the kinematic sequence is there the difference that's manifesting in that velocity deficit? And that's the science of where 2.0. Where in the shooter are we seeing inconsistency? Where are we seeing these sources of error in the shooter? That is the question. Where are the inconsistencies in a free throw shooter? So we set out to look at that. And this is this company called Mint Athletic Performance in Austin, which is run by Kate Jackson, and working with a few NBA teams to look at the biomechanics, the integration of biomechanics, visualization, analytics, and of coaching. And I'll come back to that point in a second. This is the new sort of Venn diagram of analytical player development. Again, I'll come back to that. So this is a composite image of a struggling NBA free throw shooter. What we're seeing here is 20 free throws on top of each other. And the first thing we sort of are looking at is, can we give this shooter's mechanics an MRI and identify inconsistencies at every joint? So we know this guy shoots 54%. We know that on Basketball Reference. You could look it up. Again, the theme today is, why does this guy struggle like that? And the answer, as I say, is in the joint centers. But, and there's a big but here, this data is so robust. We capture 25 joints 250 times a second with sub-millimeter accuracy. And then there's all these derived metrics for one free throw. So like a lot of modern or contemporary analytical tasks, this is a curation task. I don't know if I can play this back again. And as we build our data set, we're starting to learn what to look for the most. And most common that we're finding velocity errors in free throw shooters come from the holy trinity of joints in the launch phase, which is the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. And all three of those can cause errors and inconsistency. Just like the literature predicted and has found in non-elite basketball players, struggling free throw shooters are demonstrating more inconsistency in their processes than the best free throw shooters. So this is again Same rubric applied to a shooter who shoots 85 or 90%. And you can see that there's a lot more consistency in aggregate in these composite images at the key joints, especially the arm, the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist, as I mentioned. Consistency in the angles, consistency in the timing sequences. Consistency, consistency, consistency. So that's the lowest hanging fruit in the next revolution in, which is a very slow title, I'm sorry, but the next, free throw shooters, we got to map the inconsistency. Is it going to solve every free throw shooter? No. It's another tool in the toolbox to identify why a player might be struggling. What we see in good free throw shooters is consistency. Consistent mechanics in terms of timing, in terms of space, repeatability in the task. Again, just an image side by side. Threes are harder. Free throws, as I keep saying, lowest hanging fruit in the game. Threes are harder. Three-point shooting is a fundamental now. Hell, 30-foot three-point shooting is becoming a fundamental. NBA teams, college teams, men's teams, women's teams, international teams, three-point shooting is becoming fundamental if it's not already. Biomechanics can and will, mark my words, ladies and gentlemen, uncover new pathways to understanding the art and science of shooting a basketball. We always steal from baseball, myself included. There are pitching labs in a number of Major League Baseball facilities. There were not a decade ago. If you don't think there's going to be shooting labs in the NBA in the next 5, 10, 15 years, you're wrong. If we can look at baseball or golf as a precedent, where they are using this stuff effectively, people like Bryson DeChambeau and Trevor Bauer and people who have famously used this exact technology to build a bridge between how their bodies move and how their skills are executed. It's coming to basketball, and in the skill world of basketball, it's going to come to shooting. One of the things that I have been obsessed with as both a writer, as an analyst, and as a fan is one of the fastest growing shot types in pro basketball is the long three, the Damian Lillard three. If you look at the average three-point shot distance in the league, it's going higher and higher and higher. And you're looking at people like Trae Young who are literally shooting from distances that would have been deemed insane 10 years ago. And they're demonstrating it's not insane. But why can some shooters shoot at that deep range and others cannot? Kevin Love is a great example. He's a really good shooter. He can't extend his range very well in games. Why not? That's another key research question here. And again, biomechanics can give you the details of why. So this is a very good NBA three-point shooter shooting three-point shots, again in composite mode at the three-point line, 24-foot shot. All of those segments until the very end are white, indicating there's very consistent mechanical form there. This guy shoots 40%. One of the things I love to do as an analyst is to learn from coaches. I talked in depth to Phil Beckner, who's Damian Lillard's shooting coach. Now he works in Philadelphia. But one of the things he told me that was key with working Damian's ability to shoot from 30 feet is the core strength. And they have a mantra in their workouts saying, tight body, tight ball. And the thinking is if I can keep my mechanics consistent through that flow phase, through the energy transfer phase, through my core, my mechanics in my upper body will be consistent too. And obviously Damian's hit a couple of those big ones, like the one pictured here. They, not analysts, but in a way they are. They arrived at the right conclusion. And when we try to see a typical NBA shooter shoot from 27 feet, who can't do that, unsurprisingly, we start to see inconsistency manifest in that launch phase in the arms. One of the issues I'm struggling with right now in this project is That's the symptom. That's not the cause. I believe this shooter is having energy leaks or not putting enough energy into the ground at the base phase to create the energy needed to shoot. And so he's importing strength from his arms, which is manifesting an inconsistency in both his launch phase and the flight of the basketball. So even some of the stuff we're seeing with biomechanics as inconsistency might not be the cause of it, and that's why we have to look at the story of energy. I have to wrap up in a minute. I can't emphasize this concluding point enough. It's going to be an integration. There are going to be biomechanists in every NBA basketball operations group. I promise you that. There's going to be analysts. There's going to be coaches. And the teams that integrate these three roles and forms of reasoning the best, I'm here in the competitive advantage room, those are the teams that will generate competitive advantages for their team and their athletes. It's going to be the integration. Analytics, since we've been starting 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, has really gone from a one-person endeavor in many cases to a team endeavor. And as we get more and more complex with things like biomechanics, that's only becoming more true. So I wanted to leave 5 minutes for questions. I left 4. I hope I have some questions. Thank you guys for your time.
Is consistency something that you see like vary from day to day or from like week to week? And could that be a reason why certain shooters could be deemed streaky, perhaps like in game?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And if one of the things with this capture technology is it's such a pain in the butt, we get a guy one day and he's wearing a suit and it's not an organic environment, but he might be sore. He might be injured, and that's the day we're capturing. And this is real life for pro basketball players and college basketball players. Some days you just don't have it. Some days you're dinged up. And so I think to get these programs to be the best they possibly could be, we need to make sure we're getting samples and have a good sampling strategy throughout these players' years and days. It's a good question. I don't have a good answer, but other than that.
So what's the next step after, let's say you identify, an inconsistency in the shooter's, offhand elbow? What do you see as the next step in terms of correcting that?
I always say, thank you for asking that question. I always say, this is an MRI, and you don't want your MRI, if you tore your ACL like I did, you don't want the person who did the MRI to do the surgery, right? But you're glad you had the MRI, and that's why that C part is so key. Honestly, I think the conduit will be a shooting coach. Somebody like Brandon Payne, who works for Stephen Curry, or Chip England, famously at the Spurs. These individuals already work on shooting. I think this is analogous to an MRI because we're not doing the surgery ourselves. If I'm working for an NBA team, they don't want me to touch their shooters. But I can help these teams identify, hey, it's the guide hand, it's the timing of the elbow. And then what they do from that, that's above my pay grade, to be honest. It's a good question.
Hi there. So in his book that I know you're familiar with, Nick Green basically writes that shooting form is somewhat irrelevant, at least in terms of free throws. It's more potentially about that consistency. Would you agree that the form itself is less relevant?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd put it in those terms, but what I would emphasize is that everybody in this room has a different form. And the first process you have to go into this analysis framework saying we're all snowflakes in the old school sense of that word, not the new one, although we are all snowflakes. We have to acknowledge that the kinematic strategy I bring to the nail is different than the one you bring to the nail. And the consistency within that ecosystem that's unique to you, I believe, is the key. And one of the first things we look at is just generally what is the kinematic strategy that this player brings to the free throw line.
Last question here.
Last one.
Hey there, can you describe any correlations between anthropomorphics, so size of shooter versus consistency?
No, but fortunately I'm working with somebody who could. because I don't have that information for you. But I do think as players grow and develop in the strength room or in their adolescence, their mechanics change. And I think one thing this kind of analysis brings to the table is the ability to detect those evolutions within a player's development time. And it's interesting, everybody who grew up playing hoops, you don't have mature shooting mechanics. Even Stephen Curry changed his shot in the middle of his adolescence. So I think it's an interesting concept, and I would just argue that this kind of technology helps us understand and monitor that. Thank you guys so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.